Right, I think we can get started, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. This is a very exciting session. We get to hear from Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia, and somebody who's been an activist, I think it's fair to say, in the realm of education, particularly education for girls, but education more generally. She has, of course, been an education minister of Australia, and has been working very closely now on the international scene to address some of the big education problems that we will be spending most of this weekend discussing. Since the anchor of this weekend is the Teacher Prize, a lot of the discussion that will take place will be about teachers, as correctly it should be. Perhaps there won't be a great deal of discussion on some of the more quotidian concerns about education, but those are, I would submit, extremely important. So I'm going to try to take this session and make and address some of those. And the biggest question about education, I think we can all agree, is money. Where is the money coming from? How much money are we going to need? And how are we falling short? And what are the things that we as a world need to address? How deep into our pockets must we reach? A quick note, I'm going to ask a couple of very general questions at the top and then very quickly move the mics out to you so that you can ask your questions. When that time comes, please make your questions brief so that others can join in on the conversation. We have now 52 and a half minutes. And so, Ms. Gillard, if you would start by giving us a little tour of the horizon, set the landscape for us about the scale of the problem in dollar terms that the world faces now.
Sure, I'm very happy to do that, and it's great to join everybody here. I'm kind of conscious that my back is to a number of people, but with the benefits of the technology, hopefully we can all get a view. The scale of the problem we face is a major one. I'd like to be able to come here and say we've solved every problem about access and quality in education, but I can't do that. We know that there are around 260 million children who won't get to go to primary and secondary schools. So there is still a major access problem in our world. 75 million of those children are in fragile and conflict-affected places, and of course many are also refugee children who have gone from their own nation, crossed one or a number of borders, and we know that 50% of refugee children are not in primary school, and only 25% get to go to secondary school. Then on top of that, the access problem, we've got a major quality problem, and we're unfortunately measuring that in the hundreds of millions. I was very pleased and honoured to serve as a member of the Education Commission, which was led by Gordon Brown and supported so well by the Norwegian government, to whom we give thanks. And we researched and took some new looks at this quality problem. And where we ended up coming out was, if we imagine the world in 2030, the end of the Sustainable Development Goal period, and say, if everything continues as it is now, where will we be in 2030? And where we came out was saying in 2030, there will be around 1.6 billion young people on the planet, and fully half of them will not have had as an education that gives them lower secondary skills. So they might have gone to school for the right amount of time, but the quality's been so poor, they don't even have the skill level that we associate with lower secondary schooling, with 10 years of schooling. And yet at the same time, we know if we put the horizon out to 2030, that around half of the world's current jobs will no longer exist, and they are very likely to be replaced by jobs that require greater and greater skill levels. And so, you know, it's a divergent pattern. Skill levels required by employers going up, half of young people not even having lower secondary skills. What would it take to bridge that problem? Well, that was the work of the Education Commission, and we did spend a lot of time thinking about the efficient deployment of every dollar in education. But even if you deploy every dollar efficiently, there aren't enough dollars. So at the moment, looking globally for students in low income and middle income countries, the world spends about $1.2 trillion on school education. That's from all sources, domestic governments, international aid flows, parental contributions themselves, philanthropic contributions and the like. And we need to spend $3 trillion. So the difference between 1.2 trillion and 3 trillion. Once you're using the word trillion, you can just say, well, that's a hell of a lot.
Over what time frame? Until
well, that's
between now and 2030?
That's the annual amount we need to get
every
to
year.
In 2030, every year. Now, I know when I use those figures, people could just kind of roll their eyes and say, well, that is an unbridgeable gap and we're never going to get there. But I think that there's some, things we can draw a bit of a positive indication from. First, the biggest problem to solve here is domestic resource mobilisation in low-income countries and middle-income countries themselves. Fully 97% of what is expended on education is expended through domestic resources. Overseas aid flows are around 3%. Now, of course, that's not 3% everywhere. There are some very fragile countries where overseas aid flows are easily 40 or 50% of what's being expended on education. But if you conceptualise it like that, what we've got to do is think of new ways of growing domestic resources and ways of increasing international development assistance for education. And if we saw a lift up in effort, we could make some big yards. We've seen in recent years official development assistance going up by around 8%, but the education component has gone down by 12%. So even if we could get education to command its fair share of current international aid flows, we'd be making a difference. In the humanitarian setting, we know it's only very recently that needing to provide kids with an education has lobbed on the agenda as something really big in humanitarian crisis circumstances. So we've traditionally thought, you know, where's the shelter, where's the food, where's the water, where's the medicine? Now increasingly people are thinking, where's the schooling? And at the moment only 2% of humanitarian aid flows go to education, and if we could change that percentage then we would make a real difference for those kids in refugee and displaced style circumstances, or kids who have got, you know, an episodic disruption to their education. Think of the earthquake in Nepal, for example, that meant kids didn't have classrooms to go to, but that's a problem that needs relatively short-term assistance and then can be solved and the situation can be got back to normal. So there's a lot to do, but there's also a lot more energy around to do it. The fact that this conference commands the attention of more and more people is one indication of that. The fact that there has been this major Education Commission report is another indication. The fact the education community has come together with a shared objective to grow the Global Partnership for Education, which I chair, which works on developing education for around almost 90 countries in the world, low income and lower middle income countries. The fact the world last year created the new fund, Education Cannot Wait, to work with and alongside GPE in circumstances of humanitarian crisis. The fact we're now trying to conceptualise a multilateral development bank mechanism to unlock more money, and the fact that we've never had more evidence than we have now that the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, whether it's for peace, security, gender equality, climate change, health, none of it is achievable unless we invest in education, and I think that there's more global recognition of that now than there's ever been.
So yeah, as you correctly pointed out, when you say $3 billion, people's eyes tend to glaze over. The scale seems so monstrous. But at the risk of making it seem an even bigger problem, do you have a sense of how many more teachers we're going to need every year to meet the challenge? How many classrooms? How many seats in classrooms?
I wish I could give you precise figures, but I can certainly tell you that the global teacher shortage is measured in the many hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And we, as the Education Commission, looked at some individual countries. and the teacher shortage is so much that even if everybody who went into higher education in those countries chose to be a teacher, you basically wouldn't have enough to fill the shortage. And of course you can't have everybody who goes to university in those countries choose to be a teacher, because you need your doctors and you need your engineers and so on and so forth. So this is a very big problem to solve. The capital stock problem is also a very big problem to solve. I was recently in Malawi, which is a country with growing demographics, so more and more children every year. And like so many other parts of the world, it is common for children to still be educated outside because there aren't enough classrooms. And that means in a nation where you do get a lot of rain at one point of the year, that those classes are effectively cancelled because you can't teach kids in those circumstances. And then what is a classroom isn't, you know, the nice building that many of us would be familiar with and our own children or grandchildren or family members have gone to. A classroom is something made out of handmade bricks with a dirt floor where 100 children are sitting on the floor with one teacher who may not have had any training or only a very limited amount of training to then present to a classroom that size. So the capital challenge, the teacher training challenge is immense, and it's represented in those figures, the need to move from 1.2 trillion to $3 trillion.
There are some people, and I came to this conference last year, and there are people here then who were making the argument that technology will solve these problems, that technology is the closest thing to a panacea that will allow us to bridge past this yawning chasm and get education to the people. Do you buy into that? Are you?
Look, I'm an optimist about where technology can take us in education, but I'm a realistic optimist, and I think that there have been some naive attempts to drop technology in and to, you know, pretend it's a solution. And, you know, technology can play a role, but let's face it, technology requires reliable electricity. Many of these places don't have any electricity, or certainly not reliable electricity. Technology, to get its full benefit, requires constant interconnectivity. Many of us in our own countries, I could take you to parts of Australia where we don't reliably get that. So when we're talking about many of the countries in which the challenge is at its most profound, there isn't that reliable connectivity. And it requires people with skills and with training. I mean, when I'm completely perplexed about what to do next with my iPad, I either find a 9-year-old child to give it to, or I go and submit myself to the Apple Genius bar and have a young person with a lot of skill look at me like I'm a dinosaur and then whip it into shape in 10 seconds for me. Well, either you need a 9-year-old who was literally born with a smartphone in their hand, or you need people with the skills. And if you don't have that, then the technology is not going to be reliably working. So I actually think probably the first big instance of where the technology is going to make a difference is not so much putting a tablet into the hand of every child. I actually think the first big stage is going to be putting a smart device into the hand of every teacher, particularly when we are talking about teachers who have low levels of training and need high levels of assistance. And that might provide a sort of change agent for the teacher, allow them to form some communities of practice, reach out to other teachers, particularly when they're working in remote and very difficult settings, and use that to grow the skill base before we try and conceive of how much we would need to do to put the technology into the hands of every child.
It's not quite yet time for an Uber for education.
Well, you know, wouldn't it be nice if you know, education was as easy as opening up your phone and hitting a smart app that said, educate a child, you know, hit yes here. But we know, and this is, I think, a comparison that at the Global Partnership for Education we end up talking through a lot. Education is a patient investment. It's a process of years. It is contested. What is a good education You'd get, 10 Australians in a room and they don't debate that from morning till night. What's a good education? It shouldn't surprise us if these things are so contested in many of our own countries. Why wouldn't they be contested in developing countries? They are. It's not quite the same as conceptualising, how do you get a vaccine to every child? Polio vaccine, basically pretty much the same vaccine goes into the arm of an Australian child that goes into the arm of a child in sub-Saharan Africa. Education is different to that. I think we as a global community are just, absorbing that as there's more energy going into the education landscape. And we're probably, as we do things like work to replenish the Global Partnership for Education's funds this year, going to need to all be teaching each other something about patience. I often say education is a patient investment in a quite impatient world. One of the things the technology has given us is we all want anything we want now. We're not going to end up with children with 12 years of quality education plus early childhood development. We're not going to end up with that with an Uber smartphone app. We're going to end up through patience and making sure the system works, and that's what we seek to do at GPE.
I want to come to the GPE in a moment, but before that I wanted to ask a question because it's irresistible. As a journalist, I've had lots of conversations with education ministers around the world who will say, we think it's obvious that the central budget should give a larger portion of its spending to education, but the PM/President/ His Royal Highness just won't do it for various reasons. It doesn't fall to many education ministers then to become Prime Minister, which you have. Can you talk us through a little bit of how having been an education minister informed your decisions as Prime Minister on the subject of education? Do you feel like, having been an education minister, you were able to, maybe it's a slightly pejorative to say, but do right by the education sector in Australia when you became PM?
Well, I'm conscious that, where's he gone? Angelo Gavrielitis, who's here from Education International, but
he's smarting right now because we just beat him in the debate in the other chamber.
Oh, okay.
Angelo's licking his wounds in the corner.
Angelo was the head of our National Teacher Union at the time I was Education Minister and then Prime Minister. So if I try and put any glossy picture on this, then you've got the voice in reply right in the room. But what I would hope that Angelo would say about me is, whilst we had some arguments around transparency and making available national testing results school by school, we did have some arguments about that. What we ended up not arguing about was the need to put more money into education in Australia on a needs basis across both public and non-government schools. So Australia's got somewhat unusual system. We do have non-government schools. None of them are for-profit, but they might be a Catholic school or an Islamic school or one of these prestige educators like a Scotch college. They all receive some government funding, and there'd been this contest with the state schools about how much funding. And in a very collaborative way, we busted through that agenda and said, no, let's actually look at needs, where are needs, and let's fund the schools teaching the kids with the highest educational needs more. And that was not only a profound new way of thinking about funding, but it came with billions of dollars of uplift in the amount of money that was going to Australian schools.
So the Global Partnership, which you now chair, what is a role you think that it can play in sort of dealing with this challenge, the challenge that you set up at the start of this discussion in terms of number of kids, in terms of the amount of money that governments need to spend? What is the role that the Global Partnership can play in making that happen? How do you grease the wheels?
Sure. Well, our model, we grew out of the UN Fast Track Initiative. Now the Global Partnership for Education is sort of its own thing,
Yeah.
and we're a multi-stakeholder, multilateral partnership. So we have around the table representatives of our developing country partners, donors, civil society, the private sector, as well as the other major multilateral actors, the World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF, UNHCR and the like. Our model for change is a systems model. We are absolutely persuaded by the research that a well-planned system for schooling in a lower income environment will outperform a poorly planned system in a higher income environment. And I know actually a lot of focus at these conferences tends to go, and I don't begrudge it, but a lot of focus tends to go on, innovations that are happening in, little pockets, an NGO that's doing something blockbuster and new in 10 schools here, or a new system for getting girls to school in, 2 slums in India over here, and all of that kind of energy and dynamism is important. But when the scale of the problem is measured in the hundreds of millions, unless you are changing the whole system, you are never going to fix the problem. So our bit is to work with developing countries on making sure they have a well-planned, inclusive system, for school education. And then in the lowest income countries, we help fund a section of the plan by mobilising donor resources. And we can show through that way of working that even in some of the poorest places in the world, we have been able to make a difference to, we've been focused under the Millennium Development Goal era on primary school, been able to make a difference on primary school attendance, primary school completion rates, achieving gender parity, how many girls go to school as opposed to boys. And now we are lifting ambition and saying in this world of the Sustainable Development Goals, we want to take that systems planning approach and really make it work for secondary school as well.
As promised, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Would someone take these mics around? And I'll point out to people and then you can take. Let's start right here. And introduce yourself and keep your comments, if you want to make comments, very brief. And then ask a question.
Hi, I'm Nandita. I'm a wordsmith.
We can't hear you. A little closer, please.
You might need to.
My name is Nandita. I'm a wordsmith and storyteller from India. I've heard that the Australian system doesn't have examinations until senior classes, whereas, for example, in India, it's always about excelling in examinations from day one. Why do you think there are such contrasting approaches in different cultures to education?
That's a good question. I mean, our students in Australia would regularly sit tests, and they do these diagnostic national tests that we build the transparency data out of. So they sit national tests in grade 3, 5, 7 and 9, but they aren't, pass-fail tests. They're an information set for teachers in classrooms, but also for the nation about how well our schooling is going. But you're right, the only high stakes round of examination is at the end of year 12, and it generates this beast called a tertiary education rank, which is then used to, sort whether or not someone's got a high enough marks to go into medicine or law or one of the very sought after courses. I think all of that has probably been a national accommodation between those who would say you've got to have very rigorous testing continuously and those who don't like that kind of stress and pressure being put on students. And one of the things we do try and say to students in year 12 is it's not the end of the world. If you don't get the TER, the tertiary education rank you want, then there's various second chances and second ways in. But different cultures do put much more of a value on testing. I can't imagine that there would be a debate in Australia to go to, increased levels of high stakes testing. Also because we have universal access, unlike a number of countries where high stakes testing is historically been used to sort out who gets to go from primary school to secondary school. Obviously that's no part of the Australian system because there's universal access.
We have a question from back there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Ms. Gillard. It's such an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
And learn from you on top of that. So, my name is Abdurrahman al-Zu'bi. I'm from Dubai Cares. Recently, I had a discussion with a doctor who works on ECD, which is early childhood development. And the discussion was, if you have a leak somewhere when it comes to education or when it comes to health or when it comes to any other sector that helps in development, but you put your finger on one leak and leave the other, and it's a question that has been going on. How do we look at education, for example, within the bigger picture? How education can contribute and can be part of a whole systematic, as you mentioned, a whole systematic approach to actually lift countries up or help in developing these countries. So, if you have,
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to answer that question, and I do want to say a big thank you. Dubai Cares is a wonderful partner for the Global Partnership for Education. We're very grateful for the support you provide, so thank you. I mean, coming from my region of the world, where we spend so much time focused on Asia, when you look around the region in which I live, and you look at success story, an economic success story like Singapore or like Korea, and you ask yourself, what made that possible? I had the privilege as Prime Minister of going back to Korea for the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Kapyong, which was one of the major battles that turned the tide of the Korean War, and Australian soldiers fought in that battle. And I literally went back with veterans who had not been in Korea since they walked out of those blood-soaked battlefields, and then they land in the global city of Seoul, and their heads are spinning like, what on earth happened here? And what did happen there is really an economic miracle based on education. And it is impossible to imagine the Korea of today if the Korean people hadn't put such a premium on education. You think of Singapore at the end of World War II, unable to feed its population, its beautiful harbour littered with boats that had been sunk, choking it so other vessels couldn't get in. What explains the Singapore of today, given that history? It can't be explained unless you think about the premium that Singapore puts on education, and whenever you look at the international testing, Singapore is always right up there and often continuing to improve. And so if we know that intuitively from those nations, it seems to me obvious that we should be saying around the world, if we want people to have the benefits of peace and prosperity and the advantages that come with having a modernised economy, this cannot be achieved without education. But even more than that, we know that the health objectives we've set ourselves can't be achieved without education. The health people will tell us you can't stop the AIDS epidemic without educating adolescent girls, because a girl in school is much less likely to contract HIV/AIDS. You can't look after the welfare of the next generation without educating mothers. An educated mother is much more likely to have a child who survives infanthood. She's much more likely to have that child vaccinated. It is much more likely that that child will go to school, him or herself, and so you get on a virtuous circle of change. We know, and this is not, 100% simple, but we do know that rising education levels are generally correlated with greater peace and ability to negotiate and moderate conflict. And so in a world where conflict besets so many, why wouldn't we want a more peaceful planet? And then, with the adaptations we will need to make for climate change, we also know that empowered and educated communities are in a better position to make those adaptations. So right across the board, it just seems to me that education is the key to the sort of change that we want to see on our planet, and that we've all committed to, not in an academic way, but actually in a very specific way, through the Sustainable Development Goal agenda.
So you have a question from there, then one here, and then I'll come to you after that.
Hello, Ms. Gillard. Kelsey Munro from the Sydney Morning Herald. I wondered if you had any qualms about NAPLAN's use being extended for beyond its original purpose over the years since it's been in. There are parents using it as a sort of league table kind of way to pick schools, or in New South Wales recently it's become a literacy standard for the prerequisite to the HSC. Do you have any concerns that it's being misused or?
I don't, as you know, try to get involved in contemporary domestic debates in Australia, but you'd expect the Australian journalist in the room to make a try. And I don't want Angelo leaping up and running across, but what I would say about, the vision we had for national testing is, and I've very consistently said this, parents in countries like Australia make choices about which school to put their children in the whole time. Whether they get that information talking to their neighbour at the shops, whether they get it out of a tabloid newspaper, or whether they use the very sophisticated data set we've put before people through the My School website, they will make those choices. My own view is choices without information is really just guessing. And so it's better for people to have the information. And I am very aware that there are many families who don't have a choice. Their income levels mean they're going to rely on the state system. I'm the product of a state school education. There's nothing to be fearful of about relying on the state system. I went to great schools. But in suburban Australia, people would even sometimes have choices between the state schools and, the ones that are within their reach. But the information is only meaningful if it is grounded in its contextual information. So for those of you, and no one in the room apart from the Australians probably does know this, you can't use the data that is available about school literacy and numeracy attainment in Australia to create a league table. You can't do that. What you can do is you can compare the performance of a school with 60 schools that teach children who have the same levels of educational advantage or disadvantage. And that is very profound information to know. As long as people are holding to that kind of spirit, then I think it's, important for people to have the information.
There's a question here.
Sure. My name is Abhishek. I represent a firm called Foundation Holdings, which is trying to plug this $3 trillion gap. You mentioned, I think, access, affordability, and quality. One of the things we've seen is in Abu Dhabi, there's 37% teacher attrition. So we spoke about the teacher gap, but even once you have the teachers, it's a big issue we face in the UAE. So that's on quality. I wanted to get if you guys have done programs which have helped teachers from that perspective. And secondly, on the affordability piece, emerging markets, we've seen private sector which promises high quality, but sometimes not affordable. And then you have public sector schools which give affordability, but the quality isn't there often, especially in India too. So I don't know if there's a magical answer which can collapse the two together, and then you have quality, affordability, and access, I guess, all together.
Yes. I would just start with this observation on the public-private piece. From my own experience in Australia, when we did this huge transparency project, and any of you who are interested, you can get on the website, myschool.edu.au, and see all of this data about all 9,500 schools in Australia, public and private. What we actually found, many people before that information was available at a school level would have said to themselves, private equals good, public equals bad. And then when we actually had the data set, what people worked out was a lot of state schools were outperforming expectations. They were going really well. And a lot of non-government schools, some of which parents were paying very high fees for, weren't going as well as the historic reputation would have led people to believe when they put their kid in that school. So before we make any assumptions about the performance of sectors, I think it's really important to make sure we've got the data about the performance of individual schools. Then on the teacher attrition agenda, I stand to be corrected by the GPE Brains Trust that is sitting around you. But my sense is in most of the countries we're working in, attrition is not the prime issue. It's just there aren't enough. And actually in many of these low income environments, having a government job, being a teacher, that's a good job. So people will, train to get it if there's an opportunity, and they'll continue to hold it down if there's an opportunity. In countries, the UAE may well be one, Australia's another, where teachers have many options. They can leave the classroom and go into some administration or some other part of education. They can leave the classroom and just go and get another job in another sector, and often those jobs are less demanding, better paid, all the rest of it. Then clearly it gets harder and harder to hold workforce.
Question here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's nice hearing from you in person.
Thank you.
I'm Ritu, and I teach medicine at the Mohammed bin Rashid University here. My question relates to areas of conflict where you now are in a unique position to have an influence on. Have you all thought of a systems approach on the lines of Doctors Without Borders, like having educators without borders? And could you draw on the service of veterans who retire in really at the peak of their performing years, and are in a unique position actually to withstand the environments which surround conflict situations? These conflict situations are not going to die down. We are going to see pockets around the world, which is not a good thought, but could this be an approach?
GPE, fully 50% of what we do is in fragile and conflict-affected places. To give you an example of some of the environments in which we work, and including with displaced populations, I mean, we have been working over some period of time with a very poor country like Chad in Africa, so incredibly poor country, now host to a large number of displaced people who have come from the borders of surrounding countries and are in the Lake Chad region. And so we help a country like that wants to ensure that every child within its national borders, whether they are the children of Chad or they are displaced children who have come from elsewhere, get a great quality education. And that is, given their income constraints, that's a profound challenge. So we do that. Alongside GPE, a new body is being built up, Education Cannot Wait, which is for the peak emergency phase. So, Syrian children fleeing into Jordan, what can be done about their education? That hasn't been traditionally the work of GPE, though we are collaborating very strongly with Education Cannot Wait. And because that new fund is just in its infancy, how it's going to work and what all the best ways of working are in this crisis situation haven't been stamped out or chiselled yet. So it's a really good time for people to be putting in ideas about, is there a way of mobilising workforce from retired teachers? Those are the sorts of things that can be fed into the process right now.
Question there, and then we'll come to you next.
Hello, I'm Prachi from India, and today, as we see, education brings more uniformity. But in a country like India, which has almost more than 52 kinds of tribal population, even in Australia, it has a very high tribal population. I see once the generation that gets education as we know of, they try to negate the wisdom of their earlier generation, and they try to migrate to the bigger towns, and they lose touch with the sustainability development that their earlier generation had lived on. And in a time where going green or sustainable development is such a high priority to sustain the nature as we know it, when we are losing that kind of wisdom, how can education, global education, break down into conserving those wisdom of the past, and then telling the next generation that that should also be sustained and not lost out, and maintain their diversity and not bring uniformity across?
That's a great question, and I am later today participating in a debate about education and global values and national values, so I suspect we'll be talking about a bit of this then. But When we're thinking about the task of educating children, we've always got to be very sensitive to culture and context, and I think that does make it different from a lot of other development challenges. So, you know, for example, at the Global Partnership for Education, we do proudly say ours is a country-led development model, and we work with a country so that it can make its own choices. So there's not a global curriculum we would recommend that somehow steams out of Washington and gets put down in Yemen, and you know, that's the curriculum you've got to teach. Clearly that's not going to work. And you know, we know from our own nations, I mean, in Australia there's been a lot of debate about how we teach our history and how we teach our history respectful of the culture and practices of the first Australians, of our Indigenous peoples. So you've always got to have that local thinking through curricula customisation. Not for everything, because there are some things that are relatively standard in education. The language of maths and science is basically a truly global language. And if you're trying to explain Einstein's theory, whatever country you're going to be doing it, it's the same theory you're trying to explain. So there are ways of, you know, collaborating and getting efficiencies in some areas of curriculum, but we should never lose this local sensitivity. And so I think that means for a rapidly urbanising nation where traditional practices may be being lost, that there's some thinking to do about how best to preserve that in the curriculum so that future generations have got the benefit of it.
A question here, and then we'll come here next.
Hello, my name's Nathan. I'm a principal from the UK and a member of the Varkey Teacher Ambassadors. But just before I ask my question, can I just say congratulations to Ken, who's actually in the top 10 for this year's award from Australia. So we've been working over the last 2 days, and there are colleagues in the room that we've been working on a collaborative piece around global citizenship. And my question to you is, what makes a global citizen?
Right, okay. Well, I'm probably going to read your collaborative piece and be better informed than I am now. But in essence, I think, you know, I'm at the happy, perhaps unhappy stage of life, but the stage of life where I can look back on my own school years and think about the difference between what a child needed to know in the 1960s and 1970s. I finished school in 1978. What a child needed to know then compared with what a child needs to know now. And it is a difference in perspective between, you know, your local world being almost everything. For me, you know, we were migrants. We came from the UK, so our local Australian world wasn't everything because we still had family and connections in the UK. To understand Australia and its history, you've got to understand things about the UK. You know, we watched Hollywood movies, you know, that was the place dreams came from. So yes, you felt connected to, you know, some parts of the world. But really, there wasn't much in your day-to-day life which connected you with the rest of the world. International travel was fabulously expensive and rarely taken. International telephone calls were fabulously expensive and seldom made. You know, we'd ring our relatives once a year on Christmas Day. You know, communication was through blue aerograms that you could fold up on incredibly thin paper and fit 200 words on. So how much about the rest of the world did you really need to know? Well, you know, intellectually interested, yes, but it wasn't going to be a big part of your day-to-day reality. Now, all of that is different. Children will emerge into a globalised labour force. They'll emerge into a world where no hard problem that confronts us can be solved by one nation state alone. Every hard problem needs to be solved by all or many nation states acting together. And all of those trends of interconnectedness are just going to keep accelerating. So for me, global citizenship and its education means trying to impart to children the skills and capacities that they will need to negotiate that globalised world, knowing that sitting here today we can't predict everything about what that globalised world is going to be like in 50 or 60 years' time, but we can predict that the skills of adaptability, resilience, interconnection, collaboration, digital literacy, that these things will be even more important then than they are now.
We might only have time for 2 more questions, and for those of you who don't get a chance, we'll have the whole weekend to go up to Ms. Gillard and ask her question directly. Why don't you go next, and then...
Namaste, this is Bijal Damani, and I was one of the Global Teacher Prize finalists in the year 2015. I teach commerce in India to grade 11 and 12 standard student. I run a particular social entrepreneurship project wherein, I try to teach students how to become ethical entrepreneurs. So we run a bazaar called Galaxy Bazaar, and at the end of that particular entrepreneurship venture, whatever profits that we generate, we use those profits to simply provide, free education to the girls within our own community. I have been running this particular project for around 11 years, and we have managed to gather around, not gather, but rather earn around $125,000, and we have been supporting 350 girls so far. My question to you is there anything we as teachers can help you in moving from 1.3 to $3 trillion?
Yes. Thank you for that question. And the answer is absolutely yes. In this world, advocacy matters, and in fact, I think the presence of global movements and the impact that they have on leaders' thinking is still very clearly there. I know that there are many places in the world where the politics of turning inwards and turning away has become, quite dominant. But if you look at the world overall, I think many of today's leaders are very influenced by civil society advocacy and global campaigns. And we certainly want to make sure that this year the global campaign is around education and education for all, for the world in which they're going to live, and for a world in which we would see gender equality and girls not being left behind. And the opening session that we've had at this conference certainly gave us a great reminder of how powerful girls' education is, and it's because it's powerful that it is so contested. So in this world, we would be asking people to do everything they can to advocate for more resources for education, including more resources for the Global Partnership for Education as we go to replenishment, more resources for education cannot wait, addressing these humanitarian circumstances, so that we can be saying to each other that we're taking a step up this year, which puts us on the journey that we've all committed to as to where we want to be in 2030, where we would want to see every child in school and every child learning.
Angelo?
Thanks. And just for the record, I don't know if this is working or not, but just for the record, I was asked to ask a question. I didn't. But having said that, if I may, with the indulgence of those in the audience who are not from Australia, can I just say this, and possibly for the benefit of those who are in the audience who aren't from Australia, history will judge Julia Gillard very, very favourably with respect to the school funding reforms that her government introduced. Very, very favourably.
Thank you.
Some would have thought, yes, we had an interesting relationship. It was robust, but there were moments of great heated agreement as well around funding reform, and it worries me, even though I don't go home as often as I like. I despair with respect to the national debate and the current government's intention to destroy your funding reforms. I've got two questions, one on a domestic issue and one on a global issue. And before I go on, can I acknowledge Ken Silburn, a top 10 finalist with whom I went to school at Punchbowl Boys High School. Julia, in terms of the international scene, we see in some parts of the world, some significant parts of the world, a policy trajectory where we're seeing a rebirth of isolationism, and with it an undermining of multilateralism. What are your views in terms of the dangers inherent in that, in terms of our global responsibility to each other as citizens of the globe? And my second question, which is of a domestic significance, because there's a journalist in the room, do you give a Gonski?
I'm conscious when I come to international meetings that, given my Australian accent, half the room's probably muttering to the person next to them, what on earth is she talking about? I can't understand what she's saying. But I am happy to say I give a Gonski, which is Australian code for caring about needs-based funding. When I did these big reforms, they were initially worked through by a committee led by a major Australian business person called David Gonski, who agreed to do the work, not perhaps knowing that his name was then going to be used as a noun, a verb, an adjective, and it's part of an ongoing campaign for needs-based funding that the Teachers Union uses the terminology "I give a Gonski," so that's what that's about. On the the politics around the world, it seems to me that when we look at this trend towards turning inwards, that part of what a conference like this has before it, we've obviously been talking about education in the context of development, but part of what we've got to think through is education in the context of change. And I can understand why many people around the world of my age or older who have seen so much change during their lifetimes, and for many people that change has seemed to have been at their cost. They used to have maybe pretty good jobs in manufacturing and now they don't. They used to understand family structures, and the gender revolution has changed how that works, and they don't understand that anymore. They used to walk down their main street and know everybody who was a shopkeeper on it. Now they walk down their main street, and for some of them, their community's been so changed they don't recognise it and they don't feel like it's the community they grew up in. And so they feel incredibly dislocated by change. And the new technology keeps driving that. And that can mean that when people have that sense of, the world's moving too fast, what do I do? That they turn inwards and they drive a politics of turning inwards. I think we've got to be able to conceptualise how, as national communities, local communities, global communities, we support people through this journey of change so that they don't feel so unhappy with it that they lash out. That's a big thing to puzzle through, but I think it is at the essence of understanding nation-state politics and democratic politics in the age in which we live. So it's a big puzzle that all of us have to solve. And whilst we're solving it, one of the things we need to be saying is, in this interconnected world, whilst you might feel like you want to stop the world and get off for a while, actually you don't get to. And what is happening in your community does get impacted by the global economy and global growth rates. What's happening in your community can be affected by epidemics and poor health around the world. What's happening in your community can be affected by conflict and large people displacement and refugee outflows. What's happening in your community is not left untouched by climate change and the environmental agenda for the planet we share. And so even as you feel like you want to turn inwards, actually you've got to think about all of the connections and how you get to lead the best life you can. And actually leading that best life does require the solving of a whole lot of global challenges. And that, at the end of the day, is what the global education movement is all about, trying to help people solve those challenges. So I think we've got to be putting the case for change more clearly to people who we should have a lot of empathy for, because it is understandable to get, perplexed and bamboozled when your life feels like it's, you feel like you're a cork bobbing around an ocean and you don't get to work out the direction of the tides and the winds. So I think we need a dialogue that's really a sort of nurturing and positive one, not a combative one, for those individuals and those communities.
Here, here. I think we all needed to hear that, and from someone such as yourself. Ms. Gillard, thank you so very much for taking all these questions and sharing your thoughts with us. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say we wish you the best with the global partnership and all the very important work you do. The last time I got to speak to a former Prime Minister was the former Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron. He was in Delhi, and it turned out that the English team was playing in India and we crushed them. I'm hoping my streak continues and we do the same with the Aussies, but it's not looking too good right this moment. But in any case, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Julia Gillard.
Thank you.